Hello and welcome back to the SecurityMetrics podcast. I'm Jen Stone. I'm a principal security analyst here at SecurityMetrics, and I have with me today one of my colleagues from the team. Also, he's my boss, but I don't know if I should use the word boss, but his name is Matt Halbleib, and he has, I said, can we tell people, your bio, all the cool things you've done? He's like, I don't want to talk about me. So let's just say he has a ton of letters after his name. You can go look him up on LinkedIn or on the SecurityMetrics blog post area. But a couple of the big things are you do a lot of P2PE for PCI.
Yes.
So, but since today's topic is risk assessments, let's start off by maybe just talk a little bit about your experience with risk assessments, why this is a topic that you get to be on here with me to talk about.
Okay. In addition to the fact PCI, of course, has a requirement for risk assessments. And frankly, I don't think a lot of people really understand them or use them as effectively as they could. In my previous employer, we used risk assessments to make all sorts of decisions. And everything from, evaluating products and to both those that you're acquiring as well as sometimes selling. We had our own products that we would, of course, sell on the market. And, we do risk assessments against certain of the features and things because you can, of course, help identify potential problem areas that need addressed in terms of people attacking your products or whatever. So whether it's software or even hardware or whatever, taking a look at the attack surface from that perspective in the sense of, threats and vulnerabilities and things to it. What are the, impacts if it gets compromised and things, to using risk assessments to, of course, against the corporation as a whole, which can help you allocate budget and things. Because you know what your problems are and what you're trying to solve and what are the greatest risk to the corporation. You can use it to that. You can use it just to make decisions about individual policy things and stuff too. Sometimes if we were looking to make a change to policy or whatever, we'd do a simple risk assessment on it and go, okay, let's say you're looking at your encryption levels for data, the static data or whatever. Triple DES is long in the tooth and, should we move to some other algorithm or whatever? Taking a look at it from the perspective of, what are our options here, whether it's ECC or whether we go to AES or whatever it is, and then going, well, how vetted is that? And kind of doing a mini risk assessment on it so that you can help inform decisions.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that you said that, like, basically anything that you do. And when we were kind of briefly talking about this last week, one of the things that stood out for me on your comments was you said, preppers have a lot that they can teach us about risk assessment. And I went, oh, you know what? That is true. And I think a lot of the people that I talk to, like, risk assessment, you say the word risk assessment and their eyes just glaze over. They're like, this is the most boring topic. But you couple that with the idea that pre-COVID, people thought preppers were crazy, right? And I can tell you that because here's a little bit of a confession. I am married to a prepper. Right.
Okay.
But a couple of years into the whole COVID thing, people would come to our house and say, do you happen to have some extra toilet paper? And we did, not because we went and bought it up, but because he just happened to have a bunch stored away, And so why don't you talk a little bit about maybe why risk assessments you shouldn't consider them the most boring thing in the world?
Yeah, good question. I think, ultimately, I think one of the problems that people have is, as a friend of mine told me a long time ago, is they try and boil the ocean, essentially. I mean, that was when I was asking him about doing some of the first risk assessments, and he says, oh, don't try and boil the ocean, And so you have to be really careful about how you define the risk assessment. If it gets too big, then it becomes unwieldy, and then you're just chasing all these rabbit holes, and you just kind of start to lose track of everything you're trying to do, and it seems like it's too big and too intractable of a problem, and so then they give up.
Right.
And so if you clearly define what it is that you're trying to assess, And that's why I say, is it an individual product? Is it an individual decision?
Right.
Then you can more narrowly focus the questions around that and use that to make good informed decisions.
Right.
There was one time we were trying to make a change in, well, let's put it this way. There's always a competition. That's not the right word. There's always a little bit of conflict between security. If you look at the Dilbert, it's no, the default answer, right? Versus the security, the people on the other side saying we want to move to this. I mean, right now we all talk a lot, bring your own devices kind of thing,
right.
Or the cloud was a huge deal. I mean, I've been in security long enough that the cloud became a thing while I was in, and the company I worked for was very risk averse in that sense, and it's like we all joke the cloud's somebody else's computer is all it really
right.
means. So no way we're moving to the cloud, right? I mean, that's just no way. But then we started, of course, experimenting with some clouds internally, and you start doing risk assessments on it, and you go, well, what are the real threats to it? What can happen to it? And one of the odd things that we identified in the end was somebody could frankly steal your machine, because a virtual machine is just an image in reality. Up to then, if somebody wanted to steal your hard drives and your machine and everything else, they literally had to break into your data center to steal something.
Right.
But if they want to steal a virtual machine, it's just a file. And so in that sense,
right.
You can take information. So it actually, just in that process of going through and trying to determine if it's something we wanted to do, and could we do it securely.
Do you know, and that, I think that kind of takes it down to its essence, is it something we want to do, and can we do it securely? Because so many times, I'll especially talking to customers, I'll say, do you have a risk assessment? And they'll say, well, which one? Like what risk, what is the risk assessment? What do I need to do? What does it have to include? And that generally is because there's a lack of knowledge around what is a risk assessment even for. And so if we understand that a risk assessment isn't just, we don't just do a risk assessment so we have a report that then sits on the shelf until next year when we do another report, but instead, a risk assessment informs decisions about how we do certain things that we want to do, or whether we even do other things. You mentioned PCI, for example. So there are several things in PCI that are not full, and PCI, for people who don't know, it's the credit card, payment card industry, securing credit cards. So in the PCI standard, the DSS, there's it says, based on your risk assessment, you should do certain things. There's certain things you should log. There's certain cadences that you should have in your logging. There's certain file integrity monitoring that should happen. That there's different things, but it all comes down to the risk assessment. So, but have you seen that where people have a risk assessment, but they don't actually know how to apply it to their situation?
Oh, absolutely. People who are less familiar with risk assessments. So requirement 12.2 that you've been, is the explicit requirement in PCI DSS for having an annual risk assessment, as it says. Some people, you go there and you look at the annual risk assessment, and it's like, and not that this is necessarily wrong, but they're just looking at it like, well, what if there's an earthquake or a fire or whatever? They kind of look at very holistically at the environment and the company, and that's what they focus their risk assessment on. And that kind of a risk assessment does have a place, right? But like you mentioned earlier, when there are lots of other requirements, if you say, one complaint sometimes people have is PCI isn't so risk-based. It's a do or do not kind of standard, which, is somewhat true. Mm-hmm. But they have always, for a long time had the compensating control process.
Right.
And in there, then, you're allowed to show, well, you have to demonstrate why the way you want to meet the control is, of sufficient rigor and meets the original intent of the requirement and everything. Well, to do that, then you have to have some way to go, well, how am I different from it? what are the risks associated with that? Threats, vulnerabilities. I want to use different password metrics, right?
Right.
I don't want to change it every 90 days. I encountered somebody who, a client who, they wanted to do that. They wanted to change their password settings. And interestingly, what they did is they would go out and calculate the entropy of a person's password.
Oh.
And literally, if you said, I'm going to have a 24-character password with high complexity and everything, they'd go, yeah, knock yourself out, change it, once a year or something. And they had, they backed it up with essentially a risk assessment and metrics to go, look, this is just as good as, because on the other side, if somebody the minimum is 7 and, 7 characters with complexity and PCI, if somebody wanted just 7, they go, no, you're changing it often.
Yeah.
and so, it's one of those things that you can kind of prove to yourself and to management, because let's face it, ultimately, a lot of times you have to make that proposal to management and say, we want to do this differently. And so if you can have a risk assessment that goes, yeah, look, we've considered all of these threats, vulnerabilities, impacts, likelihoods, all that. Here's what would happen in all these different scenarios. And this is why we feel this particular change is a low risk to the environment. And then management's very informed and goes, yeah, we'll accept that.
Right. That is a terrific example, because it also talks about another function of risk assessments. Often a risk assessment is done by your security team because they're close to the risks, they understand the risks, but they shouldn't be the ones making the decisions about how they then remediate that risk, what actions are taken. That really is a business decision on how they manage those risks.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's face it, there are people, especially in public companies and things with boards, typically there's an audit board as well as finance people on the board.
Right.
Finance people have been doing risk assessments of a different kind for a long time. Security people use different language in theirs. Past life too. We kind of tried to make we tried to reconcile those two worlds and make a unified risk assessment process that security people could agree we would use it, finance people understood it. Then as things got presented up the chain and sometimes even up to a board level, people understood the language because let's face it, security, we have a lot of obscure terms. We have lots of acronyms.
Yep. We might use words even in ways that somebody else doesn't use them. So it might be a familiar word with a slightly different connotation.
Yeah, absolutely. Threats to a security person mean something different than threats to your loss prevention guy.
Right.
Or a financial guy. I did a lot of M&A work for a time.
That's mergers and acquisitions.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, I probably shouldn't say. We jokingly internally call it murders and inquisitions.
Oh no, that's terrible.
It is, but frankly, that's
a painful process.
That's the way the person on the other end felt about it.
Yes. Oh, having been through both mergers and acquisitions in previous companies, it can be a very painful process on both sides.
Yeah, because all of a sudden you got all these people coming in.
Well, you don't know my systems. Well, you won't tell me your. Yeah, it turns into sometimes like that, but sometimes it can be done well.
Oh yes.
And using using risk assessments to understand what's going on in an environment, I think is really important. I mean, if you look at recently in the news, we saw Marriott again. They acquired Starwood, right? And Starwood had a breach for 2 years before Marriott acquired them, and then they continued to have a breach for 2 years after. So a total of 4 years, right? Because the risk assessments that were performed were insufficient. And so when you look at how do we leverage a risk assessment, well, you don't just make it be an activity that you go through where you're just checking the boxes. Right? It's truly a way to discover really what's going on in the environment and then make good decisions based on that. So I wanted to go back a little bit to PCI because, like you said, PCI is largely prescriptive. It tells you things to do. You check the box. It's either yes or it's no. But the degree to which you look at something or do a thing is not prescriptive because there's no way to do that. Let's take an easy example. If you have a lot of swiper devices in your environment, one of the things you have to do is check it, make sure you don't have skimmers, right?
Yep.
Well, how often does the PCI say you're supposed to do that?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, it just says you have to do it.
It just says you have to do it.
It doesn't say how frequently or anything else.
Yeah, and so I especially when I go to the universities that we work with, I have a lot of little merchants that are together under the university umbrella, and they ask, well, I have this requirement, but what does that mean? How often do I need to look at it? How often do I need to record that I looked at it? And that's when I get to say, well, let's look at the risk assessment. Yeah. And if they say, well, I haven't done a risk assessment, central IT does that. Well, central IT does it for what they know. Do they know your environment at all? And so we'll go through kind of such a quick, lightweight risk assessment, which is who has access to that machine? Is it just you or is it other people? Where does that live when it's not with you, right? So do you lock it away in between? Do you use it twice a year? All of these things feed into, well, then what do you think is reasonable in looking to see if someone else has somehow compromised your machine? And they'll come up with an answer and I'll say, can you write me down that answer? Just a quick little paragraph. And there's a risk assessment about a specific item that was solving a specific problem, and it was meaningful because it wasn't just, oh, I'm going to go through this big old risk assessment that has nothing to do with how I do business.
Well, totally. And that's what I was trying to say earlier about defining the scope of the risk assessment, right? You really need to define what the scope is.
Yeah.
And that's a perfect example of using the risk assessment process in a very lightweight way that's accessible to lots of people, is not difficult, but in the end backs up a decision and why you did it.
Yeah.
And, let's face it, if you did that risk assessment at a higher level, whether it's the, corporate or in your case, you said a university, it's if you're doing it up at a higher level, they're not even frankly going to think about those devices for the most part.
It's very out of their radar.
It is. I know, once again, previous life, when we do a corporate risk assessment, we actually ended up breaking it up into all these different areas, finding subject matter experts for each of those particular items, IT, and we did it across all different things. But even in IT, then we'd break it up into subgroups and say, going back quite a few years, I was a Lucent Affinity PBX administrator at one time, certified,
Back in the day.
Yeah. But I knew quite a bit about telecom, and this was way before VoIP and everything. Although VoIP was starting to come in, and has its own, once again, that's another one of those, as we started looking at it, I'm kind of getting off track slightly, but as we started to bring in the idea of having VoIP, once again, we had to kind of do a risk assessment of it and go, well, what are the problems with it here?
Right.
Internally, okay, it's a network, but there are tools out there, Kane and Able. It handles all the different codecs. You can capture the traffic. You can pull the voice stream out. I mean, it's really quite trivial to listen in on somebody's conversation, right? So, knowing that, then you go, well, okay, what's the real risk? Right. Okay, well then we can mitigate that by doing some other things, putting it on its own network or whatever, segmentation.
And and VoIP is actually, voice over IP is actually a really, it's an important concept because so many people, especially during the last year, went to a work from home model.
Oh,
and the way they resolved a lot, especially for people who were doing phone calls or even call center people who are now working from home. They've been solving that work from home problem functionally by using VoIP, voice over IP, right? And so knowing that there are risks associated with that, how do you then allow that work from home while keeping security on it? So it's a way to do, again, security about a specific thing, solving a specific problem.
Yep, perfect example. You say, this is, we want to enable people to work from home. Let's examine the work from home environment and go, what are the threats to it, right?
Right.
Okay, so are we going to let them work from their own device, or are we going to provide them a system? Because if I provide a system, I can control all the elements on it.
Right.
Right. I can bring it back into my network. I can put it on a separate network for a time while I interrogate it, make sure its patches are up to date, make sure that its antivirus is up to date, whatever, before I actually allow it into the corporate environment. Right. So you can have a little remediation network, if you will, that it can attach to. It gets interrogated. Okay, now you're good to go. Now you can connect to the corporate, as opposed to having somebody's home system, which you don't have nearly as much control over.
Right.
Not always as easy to say you have to run this kind of software on it or whatever. Are you going to pay for my antivirus on my home system because you want it,
Yeah.
Risk assessments are great informers on all those decisions.
Yeah.
And then it helps you, understand, well, what's, as a company, what's our risk tolerance?
Right.
Do we want to accept moderates? I don't know. That's a little borderline, right? Can we get them down to lows, negligibles? But once again, you can say, well, let's look at the difference of having the person who's working from home use their own machine or a corporate machine. Now let's do a risk assessment on it real quick on just some of these high-level things. And now we can make a more informed decision. Yes, this one costs more, but it lowers our risk down to this. This one doesn't cost us as much, but it has more risks associated with it.
Right.
And
almost always the cost of something that reduces risk lowers the cost of something that would be the result of that risk. Did that sound really like circular? Like you're going to pay for security whether you pay now or whether you pay later. Unfortunately, that's the circumstances that we're in now, is that there are risks associated with doing business virtually.
oh yeah.
And everybody now does business virtually. As we look at different risk assessments and different cadences at which people do risk assessments, it used to be annually or after a major change. And there people are like, there's no major change, or we're gonna just make sure that our major change aligns with when we do our risk assessment anyway, that type of thing, because we didn't have something forcing these major changes. So looking over the last year, everybody had to go from working in office to working from home or working in a different way that they didn't foresee. Most of them did not have potential pandemic in their risk assessment. So that was, some people did, but most people didn't have that, right? But the sudden need to work from home should be in everybody's risk assessment now. They should know what do we do to accommodate risks associated with work from home as opposed to risks associated with working in the office. And now here's the tricky part. People are leaving home and going back to the office now. So what are now the reverse risk? What are the risks in changing once again? Because it's any major change to how you do business in our very connected world, it has associated risks. So my expectation as an assessor would be to go into an organization now and say, let me see your risk assessment. And as I read through the risk assessment, I generally ask people, can you justify why you looked at these risks and why you didn't look at these risks? And if I don't see anything about changing from work in the office to work from home and back, then I know that they don't understand the value of a risk assessment. There's a potential there to talk about how you can use this report as a tool to really direct security activities and decision making.
Yeah. Well, yeah, for me, that's like saying that past life, it drove many of our decisions. Like you say, it's a great, because even if they took in a lot of instances, we saw clients and things who allowed people to not only work from home, but then take systems home. Systems that used to only live in the corporate environment.
Right.
So now you're letting them go home into what probably is considered a more hostile network environment, right? I know people don't always think of it that way, but it is.
Right.
Because you don't control the systems that surround that on that network.
Yeah.
And so even though your machine, your company machine is there and it's got antivirus and all that good stuff, it's now on the same network with potentially less protected machines, with less sophisticated users who, are going to, their odds of getting compromised are greater than somebody, in a work environment. So your work machine went from a very protected environment to a home environment, and now you're going to bring it back in.
Right.
So great place to look at it and go,
What
okay,
did
what
it
are our risks
pick
associated
up
with
while
this?
it was out there?
Exactly.
What changed in the configurations while it was out there?
See, it was in a hostile environment.
yeah.
What potentially changed, right?
Yeah. So
Did it get a back door and now I'm going to bring it into my company and it's going to have a back door for somebody else to come in?
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, all those things can be done through risk assessments and, great opportunity to look at it and go, okay, if we're going to do that, then, we do the risk assessment. It identified that, it was in this hostile environment. We're not entirely certain of its configuration now that it's coming back into the office. What ought to be our steps so that we can have confidence in that machine and putting it on our network again?
Right. So we talked about PCI, where people get kind of worked up about, well, it's too prescriptive and I don't have any kind of flexibility. And then you say, well, what about the risk assessment for these things? And that's where risk assessment goes. And then almost on the opposite end of the spectrum is HIPAA, where it's very and people get upset because it's non-prescriptive, but it all starts with the risk. And, side note, I thought this was really funny. I get comments from people from all over the world, and I just love it. And feel free to reach out either through SecurityMetrics or through LinkedIn. Happy to answer questions. But I got one comment that was one of my favorites, where somebody from Europe who said, it sounds like in America, people get a lot more upset about compliance than we do here in Europe. We're talking about, cybersecurity. And I was like, do we? Probably. Bunch of, Wild West people.
Yeah.
and that's okay. Because risk assessments helps us with that, right? So you look at HIPAA, where people are like, well, I don't even know where to start. Yeah, you do. Because you know what HIPAA says you should start with? A risk assessment. So a risk assessment all starts with knowing what is your environment. What is the scope of things that you're looking at? And then looking at that environment, what are the risks there? If you know what the risks are to personally identifiable protected health information in that environment, and protected health information is just information related to health that can be connected to personally identifiable information. So PII connected to health creates PHI magic. So, so in HIPAA, you look at that and say, all right, I have this risk assessment. How am I protecting PHI? How am I protecting information that should be private? That is very, people don't want that information out there for a lot of good reasons.
Right.
Connected to fraud, connected to, taking over a person's identity, but also our health is personal.
Yeah.
And just having people know things about our health, we don't want that to be out there in the world, right? So,
yeah.
Totally. HIPAA says you should protect that, and you should start by doing a risk assessment. But if you have that kind of a broad ability to do things or not, where do people even start when step one is do a risk assessment? What would you tell a group that's kind of dealing with this for the first time?
Well, go out and read about some of the different standards out there, whether it's NIST or whomever. I mean, there are different risk assessment.
Sure.
I know standards not quite the right word. What would you call it? Frameworks?
Yeah.
Frameworks that you can use. If you've got a finance person, they may have some background in risk assessments themselves, done from a financial perspective, but still it can inform your decisions and your ideas. And like I say, when it comes to talking to the board and lots of different people at different levels within an organization, it's probably, as we talked about, having the right vocabulary. We say one thing, but, they may mean it as something else than we do. So it's important to be able to have that conversation on a level playing field that everybody understands. When we say this is what we mean.
And sometimes people will be like, well, shouldn't the onus be on them to understand me? Well, and my answer is always, well, it depends. What is the problem you're trying to solve? If you feel that security needs to be improved in certain ways based on your understanding, then it's on you to explain that to people in words and concepts they can understand. And any of us who wants to make things better should be saying, what can I do to improve this communication? And it makes things better. So therefore, the onus is on all of us.
Ironically, not that I've looked at it this way in the past, but as you're describing it, I'm going, well, in a way, what you're describing is a risk in and of itself. I communicate one thing, people understand it as something completely different.
Yeah.
So, yes, I agree. You need to, let's face it, like I say, security is hard, even for professionals. There's a ton of things to know. As a defender, you have to be right 100% of the time.
Right.
As an attacker, you just kind of have to get lucky once. I mean, if you're good, yeah, great. You can force some things.
Exactly.
You can get better.
Yeah.
But in essence, you just have to find one area that you can attack and get a toehold into an environment, and then start, looking around and seeing how you can pivot and move around in an organization, right? So security is hard enough as it is.
Right.
I mean, even for people who practice it every day. And so now you're putting out there these concepts and ideas. Yeah, I did this risk assessment and we found this and that problem. And if you don't go out there and educate people about what it is you're really talking about, and I don't mean that everybody has to become an expert in security. Just find ways to put it in terms that they understand, which is kind of why I was mentioning like the finance people. They've looked at similar, they've looked at their world from that perspective. They just really haven't looked at the security side of things that we look at. And so if we can find some way to help them understand what we're talking about in terms that they know, then they can become an ally for you.
Right.
Same thing in a previous job. I found that my dad was an attorney, so I can kind of say these kind of things. They're not always the most favored people.
Oh, no.
And in companies and things, right? So in any case,
there's some stress involved there. Yeah.
Yeah. What I was going to say is, from a security perspective, we found that the lawyers, if we could communicate to them what the problem was. And, it's not just a regulatory thing like PCI, we're going to have to pay some fines and everything. But, they look at things too of like, simple thing is like, well, what's your email retention period, right? Or what's your crypto period? Because, that defines, how long you're going to keep some cardholder data in PCI, right? Or how long your keys are good for or whatever. If you can clearly define, anyways, we were able to get legal on our side for many things to help push on the board and others at senior management level to go, no, this is a real risk to the corporation.
Right.
I know marketing and those people really want all this data about all these people, but like say, identity theft is a huge problem, whether it's PHI or whatever.
Right.
Downside of some of those things being stolen is that I can't change them.
Yeah.
I can't go change my health past.
No.
I can't change,
Your
where I
social
was
security
born.
number. Well,
I
I guess
can't.
you can, but,
change your social, but it's hard.
Yeah, it's
but I
pretty-
can't change where I was born.
No, yeah.
I mean, things that are very unique to you can't change. And when that information gets out there, that's a huge loss. You lose a credit card, okay, fine. You can cancel it. You can, get a new one or whatever. But losing true personally
identifiable information is that's something that we don't want to have happen, and so understanding the risks to keeping that. So telling people, well, if you have information, you have to protect it.
Right. And so back to legal, if we could show to them why something was a threat or a risk, and if it came down to a lawsuit, it's like, look, I can't defend this position.
Right.
Yeah, marketing says they want to keep this data, but for what? Oh, it's, it doesn't play over in the courts well to say, well, we just wanted to sell more product to the end user, right? It's like, yeah, but you didn't protect the people's information.
Answer. Yeah.
So, and you knew it was potentially an issue. So, why aren't you pruning your database with old information?
So as security people, sometimes we need to go to the finance people. Sometimes we need to go to the lawyers. Sometimes, so it depends on where we can get that risk heard to get the support that we need to get the people, the money, the time to resolve whatever security issue that's related to that. And so sometimes, especially if you're in the position of doing the risk assessments and then performing the remediation, if you get stuck in being able to resolve the problems you want to resolve, then maybe look for a different pathway to the support that you need.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, this has been absolutely fantastic. I really appreciate all this. Is there anything specific to risk assessments that maybe you wanted to cover that I missed today? You gave me a ton of great notes, and I don't think I got to all of it. But
that's okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, if there's something key, we can always have you back too.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Or if somebody had a real question, you could get back to me. And,
Oh yeah, for sure,
you know.
for sure. And I tell people all the time I'm on LinkedIn, and they're welcome to contact me there, or like I said, through the SecurityMetrics. We have a lot of blog posts on SecurityMetrics that I haven't really talked about before. But there are blog posts, there are white papers, there's a lot of information that we put out there for free, just so that people can improve their security in their organizations. And I think that that's a good place to start for people who have questions. But also they can reach out and we can maybe answer some questions directly. So thanks again for joining me.
Absolutely.
And thank you for joining us once again here on the SecurityMetrics podcast. I hope to see you again next time. Thanks for watching. To watch more episodes of SecurityMetrics podcast, click on the box on the left. If you prefer to listen to this podcast, it's available on all your favorite podcast platforms. See you on the slopes.